Hello, I'm John Helgen, the music director at Roseville Lutheran Church, and I'm here today with Jim Boyce, Roseville Lutheran member and emeritus professor from Luther Seminary in St. Paul, and with Marty Haugen, who is a well-known church musician and a prolific writer of music for use in worship. Hello, Jim, and hello, Marty.
Hello, John.
Today we are on our second of two sessions with Marty. In the first session, we covered some of the history and traditions of music and worship and how they've changed over time. And in this second session, we are turning to looking at what's coming up in the future, what we know about it, what we can predict about it. And so I'm going to turn it over to Marty, who's got his crystal ball here ready to tell us, having covered the historical context of things, what do you see happening? What is the future of music in worship in the church?
Well, I don't think I have a crystal ball. I'm in the same boat as all of us. I know that the pandemic has changed worship, and I think it's changed it forever, that we'll never go back to a pre-pandemic vision of the totality of worship. We'll go back to a lot of things that we had before, but some things have changed forever. And even before the pandemic, I can observe what is in front of me, but it's very hard to see the future. Obviously, technology has changed things really dramatically, but also I think the culture of music making has changed worship as well. That the whole culture, at least in America, we can't just speak for the whole world. You want specifics?
Please. Or Jim.
One of the things that in terms of looking to the future is that we can probably imagine that there's going to be a lot of change. When I reflect on my own experience in the church, mentioned in conversation before this that in my experience as a member of the Lutheran Church, the particular tradition that I'm in my lifetime, I've experienced 4 different major hymnal revisions, and each of those hymnals has had its own particular focus and themes as changes have happened in the church. So at least, and Marty, you've been involved in a number of different traditions in your experience of music. As you think about your part as a Lutheran, what have you seen as some of the key themes or inputs or traditions that have been part of the Lutheran tradition that seem to be keys for our looking to the future and what might happen as the next hymnal comes off the press, or we see those changes that you described that we're never going to be the same, you say?
I've had the opportunity, at least with my publisher, GIA, to be on several committees of hymnals produced by GIA. They're Roman Catholic hymnals, but the process is very interesting. Back when I was working on my master's, I was at St. Paul's, I was at Luther Sem for part of my time, and I took a course from Henry Horn, who had been an editor of the Red Hymnal back in the 50s. And he talked about their vision. They called it a service book and hymnal because they wanted to be ecumenical. The word Lutheran didn't appear in the hymn on the title. Then I took a course from Gracia Grindal, who was on the hymnal committee for the LBW, the Green Hymnal. And it was interesting to hear their opinions of each other's books. And I realized hymnal committees try to have a crystal ball, but they don't know either. And so sometimes they just throw stuff against the wall. And my cousin and my friend Mary Preuss was on the hymnal committee for the ELW. And she said at the very first meeting, the group on their committee, their first question was, should the Lutheran Church put out a hymnal? That was their question. And the question was, are hymnals going to disappear? Because we're moving from the era of the printed word to an electronic era. It's a different thing. And they decided that a denomination has to have some identity, and a hymnal, to some sense, creates an identity. It's not only a theological collection the theology of the denomination, but it's also ecclesiological. It says, here's how we worship, here's how we understand ourselves as church. One of the things that has really influenced me over many years is a book edited by Thomas Schatauer, who is a professor at the seminary in Dubuque. And the book is called Inside Out Worship. And the first chapter is by Tom Schatauer himself. And he talks about three kinds of worship. The first one is inside and outside, which means there is an inside in worship, and then there's an outside, which is a larger world. And it may be worlds that don't even look similar. So the words we use, the architecture, the space, the postures, the way that people communicate may not connect to the outside world. And Tom says that in the 60s, when we went through this incredible revolution in terms of society and mores and things, that people started questioning this worship, saying this isn't relevant to our lives. So he said we started to see the evolution of outside in worship. In other words, if the outside world and the world of worship aren't connecting, we'll bring the outside world in, and that will enable us to worship relevantly. And so churches began in the 70s, but it's accelerated over the years into looking more like auditoriums. This is much more prevalent in, say, evangelical churches, where you have a real sense that the musicians look like more and more like a band that could be playing in the club on Saturday night, then come into church. And in some of the evangelical churches, or some I've known, the pastor dresses down, and the media and the songs become much more given over to the musicians. And you see manifestations of this, like, for instance, in the handheld mic. I've often thought that, if you know Freud and pay attention to Freud, you see what a symbol the handheld mic is. But it also says to the person holding the mic, I can sing over all of you. I'm louder than you. And it shows a position of power. It changes the dynamic, the understanding from an equal relationship, I talked about dialogical before, to an unequal relationship. In the same way that clergy in the Catholic Church can look much more authoritative, and musicians can look much more like we're a group that have practiced, we're accomplished, we have the songs, we know the songs. That's just the church space and the audio side of it. The visual side, with screens versus books, and I don't think I even want to get into that because it's such a flashpoint for congregations, but it does something different in terms, you have to do different music with slides because a slide can only contain so much information. So that tends to drive what you sing. For instance, just a thought. I've heard really powerful and convincing arguments either for books or for slides. So I don't think we know where that's going to come down. I think somewhere in the middle. And it's also created segregated worship, where congregations will go, the music is what, even though they say contemporary worship or traditional worship might be the same sermon. What is different is the music. So the music and the music style and the music presentation determines whether this is contemporary or traditional. And as I said before in the other talk, I don't think music is the primary focus of worship. So I'm much more, it's one of the reasons I like to do music from places like South Africa or South America, and then say to people, is this traditional or contemporary? Because it isn't. It's just music. And it's basically intended to be owned by the assembly. I don't know if that's going in the direction we want to go or not, but
Yeah.
And I can't tell you where it's going to be after that, because even within the Lutheran tradition, I can see wide differences between how each congregation understands worship.
I think you raise the issue in terms of how people experience a particular way in which music is part of the service, whether it's a person with a microphone or whether it's on the screen, we experience that in the particular spaces very differently in the course of worship. And I experience that as a participant in worship. Often when there's a screen, I ignore the person who's leading worship because my eyes are on the screen and I don't need anybody to be leading. I think of that in terms of you talking about the dialogical or the communion response and participation of people. Yeah.
This is kind of a personal family story, but our family, all my siblings, so there's 5 of us together, we all are active in congregations, but I'm in a UCC church. 2 of my siblings are involved in pretty mainstream Lutheran churches. One is involved in an evangelical church that's pretty low church, and one of my siblings is involved with a mega church north of the Twin Cities. And she was talking, we don't talk religion and politics much in our family gatherings because it doesn't go well. But we were talking, and my sister was saying how wonderful their technology is because they have simultaneous services upstairs and downstairs, and it's timed so perfectly that the preaching pastor, there's a preaching pastor, will get up into the pulpit upstairs and appear on the screen downstairs at the same time and give the same sermon. And she's talked about this wonderful technology. And then this is the passive aggressive thing that comes out of my Norwegian background. I said, is the screen bigger or smaller than the cross? And she said, shut up. So it's symbols, and symbols have power.
Yeah. Well, you've commented that you see, earlier you commented in our first session about the matter of the adding of microphones beginning about in the 1930s and so on, and how that changed worship spaces and what you needed as opposed to the old cathedrals and the ability of sound to reverberate and so on. So that meant you could do different things with spaces, but also now we've experienced that you can do different things with technology too. Now we have all kinds of different models happening with experimenting with different technologies. We don't know what the future looks like, but what do you suspect? What do you see happening? We're experimenting with a lot of that during this pandemic when a lot of churches are experiencing worship from a distance. How do you think that's going to change?
Yeah, it's interesting. Two models of what worship does theologically. One is transcendence. God, the majesty, the awesomeness, and a cathedral does that. See these vaulted cathedrals, especially in Europe, these beautiful ones that speak of transcendence. And then the other side is immanence. God is present right here. And that's more like the house church. And is one better or worse than the other? No, it's just 2 different ways of looking at it. And I think we have moved in much of our religious life toward the immanent. God is close. And the people who really react against that are saying, I want this to go back to this transcendent awesomeness, that God of majesty and wonder. And so it's a difficult balance. And I think the Taizé movement was an attempt to try and balance that. This music that is very much out of a tradition, the text anyway. Some of it's even in Latin or a variety of languages, and the silence, but a group of people sitting close together, silence, singing, scripture. It's, for me, that is a way of sort of trying to address both of those. Although, at our church, several years ago, we introduced silence. And I think in a lot of Protestant churches, if silence goes on for more than 15 seconds, you assume that something has gone wrong. But we started doing this, and now we can get up to about 2 or maybe even 3 minutes of silence. We ring a bell, and then after the silence ends, the prayers erupt after that. And I've found that people have come to really appreciate that as one element. Also, I think I would hope that communities that have variety of services, a variety of styles, find times to come together in some way. Maybe during the high feast days like Christmas or Holy Saturday or Easter Sunday, to find a way to have communities celebrate together. At my first church, my second church, the Catholic Church, they had a folk group that sang at one service, and they had a choir and organist at the other. And I wrote a setting of the liturgy for them, and I wrote it with two different accompaniments, one with organ, brass, timpani, and the other with guitar, piano, and bass, same melody. And I told the folk group, this is your new Mass. I gave it to the choir and said, this is your new Mass. And then we sang together on Holy Saturday, and everybody was happy. But it was an attempt to try and say, if you go to a different service at your church and nothing makes any sense or is familiar at all, you're creating two different communities. And maybe you just need to acknowledge that, but it's changed. Even if the sermon is the same, the music is so important. And music is a dangerous tool. It can be used to unite, and it also can divide.
As you were talking about those things, it occurred to me that, and I was thinking about my own experience in this time of the pandemic, where much of our worship has been through technology, on the internet, YouTube, etc. I'm experiencing, a part of that because technology is so good. I'm experiencing the same music, the piano and the organ and the choir or people singing, etc. And it occurs to me in this conversation, when I think about what is it that I miss about our worship, it's really more about the spaces and the space of that worship experience than it is more about the people. Because, I can talk to people through Zoom. I see the three of us together here on the screen, and I can interact with my family through Skype or Zoom or whatever. So it isn't the personal touch that I miss in terms of those aspects of worship. It's that music and that whole worship experience that's set in the spaces of worship. And I really miss that totality of that experience. There's an emotional depth. I think, for example, I can listen on the radio to the symphony playing a beautiful piece, but there's nothing like being in the chapel at Luther or in the presence of a live symphony playing or in a live performance of a musical group. There's a dimension to that is just enriching that I don't get that on the computer screen when I'm watching a service.
I wouldn't say it's just the music or just the space. It's people in the space. When we do contemplative, tonight I'm going to do contemplative service in my parish. It'll be one of the pastors and a cameraman and me, and we're doing a contemplative service. And I can't hear anybody or see anybody. And what they can see or hear is different. Even the silence, when we do contemplative services in the chapel before the pandemic, I would sit in the room with 40 people in silence for 3 minutes. And that is so different than sitting in silence by yourself. Even though there's nothing, it's just the sense of community in a space. And I think that's what so many people miss. It's not satisfying. And it's probably the hardest thing for me in the pandemic is not being able to sit down with other people face to face over a table or in a church space. No, it's not the same in the screen. And I think, one thing I can say with some confidence is post-pandemic, we're still going to have streaming worship simultaneously, because we have found that for people who can't get out or are incapacitated in any way, it provides a way to be in touch with your local community, not just some cable station with a big church service, and that's important. We really miss. I mean, the part that I like the best about Mayflower's virtual worship is getting to hear the sermon. But the rest of it is not as satisfying as when you're being there.
I think you're saying that our spaces, they're important, and they're a big part of the way we experience things. We have been talking in terms of what our space in our congregation needs to look like going forward, and to change with the times, with developments, with pandemics, with new things that have happened. But I think what we're hearing is that it's kind of a both and. We miss the setting and the space and the people around us, but we also have learned that there's another aspect to it in the content of what we're still able to hear through technology, and that's also important. So as we look to the knowledge that eventually, and the hope that we're going to get back to being in worship together in our space, and other congregations in churches and spaces all over, how can we, I guess I feel hopeful about that. Do you agree with that? And can you
One thing
that?
you'll find that I found in at least 2 or 3 of the places where I worked is that people become very attached to the space. And every time you want to do physical renovation, whether it's an instrument like an organ, or moving the pews, or changing anything, people get very worked up that is important to them. So over the years, people see the space as critical. The church I belong to now had a woman who for years made Christmas decorations, and she was the only one who didn't realize how awful they were, terrible. And finally, we realized we had to do something. So they finally convinced her. They said, we've had a committee decide we're going to do new decorations. If you'd like these, you can come and get them. But it was the kind of thing that in a church, 1 year becomes a unique experience. By 2 or 3 years, it's a tradition. So a worship space becomes very attached. Probably, and you were talking about changing times. The other thing that I found was really wrenching in some communities is changing the time of worship, because people become attached to that as well. But I think regardless, I think churches are going to have technology at any moderately or larger size church. Our church has been blessed to have a couple people who are really smart about doing the live stream technology. But I think that's going to become a ministerial position, just like musician or education director, that each church is going to have the ability to do live stream as well as in-person service. Most people will come when they feel safe. I think people need that, but there will always be people who will need to have the live stream. And so that'll happen too. As far as the worship aids, we talked about this, touched on this last session, but I think many churches will end up trying to do a combination of screens and something in the pews, whether it's a bulletin or a hymnal, because I think real rich worship is going to involve a variety of ways to have people involved and engaged. I think a church that went just to screens is going to run the risk of limiting their repertoire and limiting people's understanding of how they're engaged. The best kind of screen is a screen that disappears when you turn it off. You don't want a screen that's a symbol all the time. That can be real problematic. And there's ways to do it so you project it on the wall, and then when it turns off, it's just a wall. But I do think the screen as a symbol, just like the book, the Bible is a symbol, the microphone is a symbol, the way people are placed is a symbol. It says something, even though we're not aware of what it's saying. So the one thing I was talking about Tom Chateau, and I want to come back to that for a second. I talked about outside and inside worship, 2 different realities. And then inside out worship, which has evolved over the last decades, outside in, where you bring the world in and try and make the world of worship look like. The one that Thomas Chateau said, the third one was inside out worship. So you take what you say and do in worship and bring that to the world. So if you say, peace be with you, then we say to yourself, what does this mean, worship for the world? And the way to build authentic and vibrant communities is make the deep connections between, if you say, do not be concerned with the things of the world. So then you ask yourself, what does that mean? You see it in ways like, for instance, the narthex or the entryway becomes sort of a bridge between worship and the world. So people walk through there, coming in and going out, where there's all these opportunities to engage with what they hear in worship. And I think that becomes critically important. Communities that are vibrant and alive. John Schramm, who was the director at Holden Village for years, was asked, how do you make a vibrant community? And he said, well, you pray together, you play together, and you have a focus outside of yourself. And that's what inside out worship is. It's saying, what does our worship mean in terms of how we take this out? So instead of bringing the world in here, especially if the world is dysfunctional, which we've seen from time to time, we say, how do we take worship and the message we hear and make it relevant in the world? And that can be done through music too. You can have the transcendent, beautiful hymns, let all mortal flesh keep silent, but you can also have the hymns that challenge people to take things to heart. My hymn, All Are Welcome, was banned in a number of Catholic dioceses. And they said the problem is that it's not true. Not everybody is welcome. And so we can't be singing this, because if we sing it, people might start to believe it.
There's also always the place for dreaming of what might be, not just what is.
Yeah. No, I gave a presentation in Victoria, British Columbia, and before I gave the presentation, they had the local group do a little prayer service, and I think because I was there, they did All Are Welcome. And during the Q&A, a young gay man came to the microphone and said, I see this in front of every church that I go to, and I go in and they sing your hymn, and how could you have written such a hypocritical hymn? Because I'm not welcome. And I said sort of what you said, Jim, that we not only sing the reality, but we sing the vision or the hope that we get to that point.
Yeah. As you were talking about that matter of spaces and the inside out, I thought particularly of Roseville Lutheran Church. I remember at the several things in terms of our history of spaces and worship and so on. One of the things that we lost in going to our present sanctuary is what was when the old sanctuary, the second sanctuary, was built back in the 1960s, when that hexagonal church worship center, which had a hexagonal shape in which the congregation seated in the round. When we came to worship, we faced one another around that center circle. It was a little tricky to preach or to lead, because you had to face 360 degrees almost. But there is that dimension of the interaction between people that is there. You couldn't worship without staring one another in the face. Now
growing up, we had the pews in the same direction. We didn't have to look at anybody.
Now we're somewhat in an arc, but we can't look at one another while we worship. And I think we lost that. On the other hand, I remember that as we designed that new place, one of the change orders was whether or not to have the Luther Commons space, as we call it, that gathering space outside the sanctuary. And I have been so happy, because it has set the tone of our congregation, that we ended up putting that space in, and now we use it for everything. And it's a space that's almost as large as the sanctuary, where people gather, not just in worship, but also in community outside the worship space. And people don't just come out of worship and out the front door, but they come out and they gather, and there's a chance for conversation, for entering into activities. I mean, the exercise group exercises there and all kinds of things. And it's in worship space. It's in this expansion of that. And I think that's all part of the experience that begins or focuses around worship and the people gathered. But I think that's an important part of what we have as a blessing at Roseville Lutheran.
That's wonderful. We before pandemic, we get to take care of two of our grandsons every week. And as we drove into South Minneapolis, we went past Roseville Lutheran Church, and they had a big banner on each side of their steps. On the left-hand side, it said, "All are welcome." And on the right-hand, it said, "Seriously." and I think that was sort of a reminder that we can use words without really taking them seriously.
Sure. Yeah.
There's a wonderful church in San Francisco. I'm trying to remember the name. It's, but they've got all the saints painted around a cupola above there, and including the saints. It's just not only the ones that the Catholics typically use, but there's Martin Luther, there's Bonhoeffer, there's Dorothy Day, there's all these people, and the people dance, and it's a circular church. But the remarkable thing for me was after worship each Sunday, they went to the table, the altar, and they made sandwiches there, which they took out and offered to the homeless. They would come in. And I thought making that connection between the communion table and the table of the world was so beautiful in that image. And it was, the people got it. They didn't have to be told. They understood that this table was not just for us, but it's the focus outside of ourselves. And there's creative ways to do that for every community if that's sort of in their mindset.
I think that's a time where we can kind of bring our session to a close. Any final thoughts, Jim?
I was just going to add one example. I mean, your example of the sandwiches. The first time I experienced that was, I think, back in the mid-'60s when I attended for the first time a Greek Orthodox church in Minneapolis. And a group of us seminarians went there for worship. And after the service was over, the service wasn't over because a group of ushers came up carrying baskets and passed out sandwiches to everybody that was there at worship as kind of a post-worship picnic. And I thought, what in the world is going on? I mean, it was such a new experience. I mean, I grew up with potluck suppers and so on, but those were never part of the worship service. I mean, to have the passing out of sandwiches, and I mean, I thought about that in terms of the different ways in which different traditions think about worship and what's going on in the gathering of the people. And I thought, of course, later on, I thought, of course, this is the Orthodox tradition where they read the Gospel of John, not the Synoptic Gospels, where in the Gospel of John, the post-resurrection experience is to gather with Jesus at the barbecue on the beach, where they roasted and had a barbecued fish and so on. So this is part of the experience of the resurrection, to pass out sandwiches. And I thought that was such a great example. And we do that in different ways. But I'm just talking about that we experience, as if we're open to different experiences, we are open to a variety of ways of experiencing worship and the church, if we're open to allow those things to impact us and to expose us to different ways of thinking about our time together.
I thought of the name of that church. It's St. Gregory of Nyssa, Nyssa, St. Gregory of Nyssa, San Francisco. If you go to Google Images, they'll show you pictures of their community dancing around the altar and baking sandwiches on the table.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for letting me have a chance to be a part of this. This has been good for me.
Thank you, Marty and John. It's been a great conversation.
It's Thanksgiving time, as you know, and I think that as a concluding thought, I'd say we can certainly be thankful for the rich history of music in the church and in our worship, and we can also be hopeful about what will happen in the future. So on that note, thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.